Want to give a quick thanks right off at the beginning to Harlan and John. Brave New Books is like one of Austin's most awesome resources. Yeah. Well, we'll go ahead and get started and give you an overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. First of all, we're going to talk about me and why would you want to listen to this crazy woman. A little bit about U.S. food prices and the distribution system that we currently have, as well as production. We're also going to talk about the three main factors affecting food prices and why I would be bold enough to say your grocery bill will double in 2011, and I will add to that, I hope it only doubles in 2011. We're going to talk about what you can do about it, because there's problem and there's solution. We're going to talk a little bit about storing food. My forte, and what I believe is ultimately the solution, is of course growing your own food. And then at the end we'll talk about how much land do you need, how much water do you need, some of the nuts and bolts and some of the overview pictures of if you're going to get started on this adventure, what do you need to know, and maybe a little bit about crop distinctions. And then we'll talk about, practically what do you need to do to get started. And mention some people here in the audience are living in apartments. We have some people with a lot of land. We'll try to cover and touch base on a lot of those different spectrums just to make sure we get everybody included. Let's get started. I'm Marjorie Wildcraft, and I got an electrical engineering degree with honors, and either by luck or intuition or whatever, I started out in the late 80s with the cellular telephone industry. I remember interviewing for a job at Motorola, and I was wondering, how did they make those phones do it without the wires? It was a big deal back in those days. And if anybody knows, working for the multinational universe, in a really hot industry, if you even have a modicum of competence, you can really shoot up through the corporate ranks. And I did so, and had a wonderful time in that industry. I am an engineer at heart, although I'm a recovering engineer now. Somewhere in there I met a man named Robert Kiyosaki, and this was before he got famous, and was a student of his, and really got the passion to make money, and have money make money. And ended up taking the savings from my electrical engineering degree and investing in real estate and becoming a professional real estate investor. Now, I never got to be like the likes of Donald Trump, although I kind of wanted to be. But one thing about being a real estate investor, and this is why it all ties in, is you're going to be managing a lot of debt if you're going to be making money. And I was always very curious about that debt. And we had built the business up to a fairly successful level, my husband and I finally figured out all that debt is coming from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And I looked at their business model and I said, oh my God, they're going to implode, and when they do, they're going to take down the insurance companies first, they're going to take down the banking system, then we're going to have the large employers going, and basically the U.S. economy and the global economy, and that's where we are knee-deep into that process. It was precipitated in 2008, if you remember the headlines there. And the main reason that we've had this breather of 2 years is, the $3 trillion that the U.S. government has spent? So we are very much into that process, and it is continuing to unfold. As soon as we saw that, which was just right at the early part of the turn of the century, we panicked. I panicked. And said, we liquidated the whole real estate business. All our partners were like, what? This was supposed to be a long-term thing, and at the end of it, they thanked us profusely. But gardening classes, permaculture workshops, tree pruning, citizen forester, anything we could do, homesteading classes, anything that we could do to learn how to grow food, because my whole background, corporate business world, I didn't know anything about this stuff. I was like, this is going to be a huge crisis, and how are we going to figure it out? And you can't do it alone. How are we going to have other people figure this out? So that's a little gist of my background. And let's jump right on in there then and talk about the current situation with food prices. Now, this is a chart that's promulgated by Casey Research. Doug Casey has a newsletter, and they talk a lot about how to help position yourself for the coming changes, economic collapse, or what have you. They have very good information. And as you can see, this was put out in October, but these prices, if anything, have only gone higher. The main thing to really note is way down here, that little bitty number is the Consumer Price Index, which very clearly does not reflect the prices of things that are going on. Another source of information that I use a lot of times to kind of get a sense of what reality is going on in terms of food prices and what might be happening with inflation is the National Inflation Organization, NIA. They're at www.inflation.us. And they produce some really pretty frightening videos, but they also are continuously giving out information that reflects reality versus the numbers that our government is feeding us. Let's talk a little bit about some factors that play into this is going to be the food distribution system. And we have this vast network of interstate highways. And it sometimes is a shock for people to find out that, we go in those grocery, H-E-B, the local grocery store, it just looks huge. Look, there's a ton of food in there. But really the reality of it is at any given time, there's only about a 4 days worth of food supply. And if you go there early in the morning, about 6 in the morning, you'll see those big semi-trucks backing up and unloading food every morning. There's not big warehouses of food out there somewhere. There's only 4 days worth of supply. Now I'm in the preparedness kind of survival niche, and I got a lot of people come up to me and say, Marjorie, my plan is I'm going to take my Glock or my AK-47, I'm going out to country, I'm going to steal my food from people like you. And I've heard that a lot. I mean, that really is a plan that people have. And this is Texas, they're well armed. But, the reality is there isn't any food growing out in the countryside. Over the last 60 or 70 years, we have completely dismantled the mom and pop farming. And anybody out there, and I challenge all of you, go out and drive around the countryside and see what kind of food you have growing out there. Austin, we're here in Austin, Texas. This is a pretty progressive community. We've got lots of farmers markets, lots of edible Austin, a lot of initiatives going on for local food. And I would be willing to bet that less than 5% of the food grown locally here is the food consumed here. We have about 1 million, give or take a few, in the Austin metropolitan area, and that's a lot of people. Food travels about 1,500 miles on average to get to us, and that data comes from the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. It's based on being out in the Midwest, but it's essentially true. Going to, like here in Central Texas, you go in the supermarket, you see tons of food from Mexico and Chile, even China. My God, we're importing food from China, isn't that crazy? But the food is just not nearby. You can't go out in the countryside, and if you try to find me, of course, you're not going to find me, and I'm also well armed. I'll point that out right now. So there's a saying, and it says that we're only 12 meals away from anarchy, and that's about 3 days, 4 days worth of food supply. It actually goes a lot quicker than that. This photograph here on the bottom is grocery shelves in Brisbane, Australia. They've been having flooding there. Destroyed about 20% of their crops, and it's taken some human lives. This is what the grocery stores look like there. And I wish I'd have grabbed, there's in Atlanta, it's the state of Georgia has also been having some bad weather, and there's reports of grocery store shelves being completely stripped there also. This stuff goes quickly. Now, the other thing is people think, well, the U.S. is never going to be in trouble because we grow so much food, we feed all the Africans and we feed all the Indians and we're always giving away food, we produce a huge amount. And maybe at one time we did, but that is no longer the truth. We export about 15 to 20% of all our agricultural products, only about 15 to 20%. And we're almost a net importer of food. So really there's not a net of a huge amount of food that's left over. And by the way, most of the food that we export, our biggest export is GMO corn and soy, which in my humble opinion is not a food. And the main things we import are like fruits and vegetables, beer and wine, cheese, that kind of thing, nuts. So in my humble opinion, it's really not a fair trade because we're getting a lot of good nutrition and we're sending them absolute crap. But this is the talks about our food crops, what we produce. And as you can see, corn, by and large, is the largest crop that we produce. And the white areas are the amount that we export of the crops that we produce, to kind of give you an idea of how much we're exporting. And that's pretty similar across the board also for oilseed and meat and other things that we export. Now, if you notice on the corn, that big chunk of red on the top is actually ethanol production, corn for fuel, and there's a little bit of breathing room in there, although again, in my humble opinion, GMO corn is not a food source. And it's very unlikely that they're going to dismantle the whole ethanol production thing. I don't know why we got into it in the first place. But so this gives you a breakdown of some of our major crops. And every other one, even after wheat, is almost negligible in comparison of how much we produce. The weather, we're going to get now into the three major factors for causing prices to increase and why they've been increasing already. The first is the weather. You got to have rain and you got to have reasonable temperatures to grow food. Now, most of us, when we watch a horror story about the freezing temperatures, the big storms hitting America, we think, oh, those poor people are going to be stuck at the airports, We don't think, oh my God, what crops are being destroyed. But in reality, that's what's going on. And it doesn't matter whether you believe in climate change or not. The fact is we are having more and more severe and erratic weather. And over the last decade, as a species, we have eaten a lot more than we produced. I think basically 9 out of the last 10 years, we've eaten more than we produced. And we are down to where even the USDA says they are critical levels of reserves. And that basically means there's almost no reserves. One great example of droughts in Russia, last summer, the Russians had a big drought, and they basically said, we're going to put a ban on all exports. And Russia used to be the 3rd largest wheat exporter. And they said, well, we maybe lift it up in the fall, we'll see how the weather is. Well, the drought has continued. And Russia has gone from being one of the largest wheat exporters to going out on the open market to buy food for their peoples. There are other crops, potatoes and things like that, their main staples, have also been failing. This has been going on all over the world in pretty much every major food producing region. As you can see here, we've had the flooding in Australia, India. India is real interesting, by the way. They're not a huge producer of sugar, but they're big enough. And they're talking about putting an export ban on sugar, and when they do, that's going to cause the sugar prices to just go crazy. And then, of course, you're watching some of the news as the freezes that hit Florida. I was down visiting family over the winter, and all the tomatoes and orange juice, they're like, forget it, it's going to be expensive for a while. So that's a quick overview of how weather is impacting us. So we're basically down to almost no reserves, and as long as we have this crazy weather, it's only going to get worse. The other factor of the three that are most important for why our food prices are going to increase is the price of oil. And this chart here, this is where I was going before, is the United Nations, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, and this is their data that they've just released as of December, and they make this food price index. And I would say that this index is probably much more indicative of the real prices that you're experiencing than the consumer price index. And so how many of you have been noticing increased food prices in your grocery bills? Yeah, that's probably why you're here. It's real and it's happening. This FAO index from June of last year till now has increased 26%. And my personal opinion and experience of watching food prices in the grocery store, that pretty much aligns with the experiences most people are having. But one of the neat things to notice is how well the price of oil correlates to the price of food. And it makes sense when you stop and think about it, because every step of the process of growing food and harvesting it involves using oil. One of the things that was very interesting when this chart first came out was the FAO announced to the world that we should expect food riots to break out worldwide this year. And what they're basing that on is, you see that peak in 2008 when the index reached that level. That's when we started to have, does anybody remember in May of 2008, it was in the news, it was a big food crisis. Even here in America, Costco was limiting people to only buying 3 bags of rice at a time. Fortunately, that all kind of calmed down and died down as the price of oil went back down again. But the food and price index has surpassed the 2008 levels. And already we are starting to see food riots breaking out. And of course, the red flag for you is when you see these things, yes, they're hitting the poorer countries first, the ones that are more marginal.